It started on one of those heavy summer afternoons, when the air feels thick, like it's holding secrets. The kids were restless, fighting over crayons at the kitchen table, and I had a mountain of laundry glaring at me from the hallway. I remember standing there, half in the living room, half in the kitchen, wondering if I had enough energy left to make dinner. That's when my phone buzzed, and it was her, Melissa. She lived 3 streets over. We'd met at a library reading event 2 years ago, bonding over the chaos of raising toddlers and trying to keep some shred of ourselves intact. She had this way of making motherhood feel less like a drowning act and more like a team sport. That day she texted, "Want me to come by and give you a break? I can watch the kids while you catch up on things." I swear I almost cried from relief. My husband Mark was still at work, at least that's what I thought, and I figured it would be nice for him to come home to a calmer house. Melissa showed up 20 minutes later with iced coffee for me, and juice boxes for the kids. She slipped off her sandals, kicked them neatly by the door, and immediately crouched down to my daughter's level to ask about her drawing. It was so natural, the way she fit into our home. She'd always been like that, effortless, warm, the kind of friend you think you could trust with anything. I remember feeling lucky, even a little guilty for having someone like her when other mums I knew were lonely and burnt out. While she played with the kids in the backyard, I tackled the laundry, and even took a quick shower. I could hear their laughter drifting in through the open windows, and for the first time that week, I let my shoulders drop. I didn't know it then, but that day was the first in a string of moments that would unravel my life in ways I still struggle to believe. Over the next few weeks, Melissa started stopping by more often. Sometimes she'd just be in the neighborhood, with extra cookies she baked, or she'd offer to pick up the kids from school if I was running late. Mark seemed to like her too. They'd chat in the kitchen while I was in the other room, and I told myself it was nice for him to have another adult to talk to who understood kids. One night, after she'd watched the kids so we could go to a movie, I came home to find her sitting cross-legged on our couch with Mark, both of them laughing at something on his phone. They barely noticed me come in. I brushed it off. It was Melissa, my friend, the woman who helped me breathe when motherhood felt suffocating. But looking back, I realized the small things had already started to shift. Mark seemed more distracted around me, more guarded. Melissa's visits stretched longer. Sometimes I'd walk into the room and feel like I'd interrupted something, though they'd both smile like nothing had happened. I told myself it was paranoia, that I was tired, overthinking, letting insecurity creep in where it didn't belong. The truth was, I trusted her more than I trusted myself to see what was happening right in front of me. A few days later, Melissa offered to take the kids to the park so I could have some me time. She even used those exact words, like she'd read them off some self-care blog, but her tone was so genuine that I didn't question it. I used the couple of hours to catch up on housework and finally fold the laundry that had been sitting in baskets for days. When they came back, the kids were glowing, chattering over each other about the slides and the ducks at the pond. Melissa smiled at me like she was handing back a gift instead of 2 sticky, grass-stained little humans. I thanked her and promised I'd return the favor sometime. She waved it off. What are friends for? I remember the way her eyes flicked toward the hallway, where Mark was coming out of his home office, like she wanted to make sure he saw her. That night while I was rinsing dishes, I overheard them talking in the living room. Nothing dramatic, just about a TV show they both liked, but it was the ease in their voices that struck me. The kind of ease that comes from hours of shared moments I wasn't part of. I told myself it was fine. I even joked about it to Mark later, saying, "You and Melissa are becoming quite the duo." He laughed, but there was something in his eyes I couldn't read. Then came the night she texted me out of the blue, saying she was nearby and asking if she could drop off a book she thought I'd love. I told her to come by. Mark was already home, lounging in the kitchen with a beer, scrolling his phone. She showed up in this casual summer dress, her hair still damp like she'd just gotten out of the shower. They started talking while I was putting the kids to bed, and when I came back, they were sitting a little too close at the table, leaning in, whispering. When they noticed me, they both straightened up, and Melissa held up the book like it was some kind of peace offering. I pushed the uneasy feeling down and told myself not to make a scene. The thing is, I've always been the kind of person who gives people the benefit of the doubt until I have a reason not to. It's a strength but also my biggest weakness. Over the next couple of weeks, Melissa seemed to be around whenever Mark was home. She'd come over to help with dinner, or bring wine, and I started to feel like a guest in my own home. The kids adored her, which made it harder to set boundaries without feeling like I was taking something away from them. One Saturday, she suggested we all go to the farmer's market together. It sounded harmless enough, so I agreed. But as we walked through the stalls, I noticed how often Mark looked at her when she wasn't looking, and how she'd brush her hand against his arm when she laughed. They thought I didn't see it, but I did. That night, lying in bed, I replayed the day in my head, the subtle glances, the little touches. My gut was screaming, but my mind kept saying, don't be paranoid. I wanted to believe that the woman who had held my baby when I was too exhausted to stand would never cross that line, but there was a shift in the air, and I couldn't unfeel it. A week later, Melissa called early in the morning, saying she could take the kids to school since she was already heading that way. I was grateful, honestly. It meant I could drink my coffee without rushing, and maybe even take a shower in peace. She picked them up with a big smile, waving at me from the driver's seat. I noticed she'd put on a little more makeup than usual for a school drop-off, but I brushed it aside. An hour later, when I went to grab my phone, I saw a text from Mark. Going to be late tonight, meetings ran over. That was normal enough, except something about it felt staged, like he was letting me know in advance not to expect him. The day went on quietly. I did chores, answered work emails, tried to ignore the nagging thoughts in the back of my head. Around 5 p.m., Melissa texted me again, asking if she could drop by to bring some leftover lasagna she'd made. I told her sure, and she came over right as the kids were finishing homework. She stayed for dinner, chatting with Mark when he finally came home. The way they looked at each other, like there was some silent joke between them, made my stomach twist. I caught myself zoning out at the sink, hands in soapy water, just listening to their voices. Later that night, after Melissa left, I asked Mark casually if he'd seen her earlier in the day. He hesitated for a fraction of a second before saying no, just tonight. That hesitation was enough to plant a seed I couldn't shake. Over the next few days, I started paying closer attention. Melissa's visits always seemed to line up with Mark's schedule, even when she had no reason to be here. If he had a day off, she'd happen to stop by. If he was working from home, she'd come over with lunch. Once I came back from running errands to find them in the backyard, sitting closer than friends should, both leaning in like they were sharing something intimate. They didn't see me at first. I stood there for a second too long, feeling like I'd walked into a scene that didn't belong to me. When they finally noticed, Melissa jumped up and asked how my errands went, her smile just a little too bright. I told myself to stop imagining things, but my heart was pounding. I started noticing changes in Mark too. He was more distant, less affectionate, and when I'd tried to talk to him about anything deeper than schedules or bills, he'd shut down. The intimacy between us felt strained, like there was a wall I couldn't get past. I told myself it was just stress, the kind of slump couples go through after years together, but deep down, I knew it was more than that. The night it finally clicked, we were all in the living room watching a movie. Melissa had come over, just for a little while, but somehow ended up staying through dinner and into the evening. I got up to put the kids to bed, and when I came back, I saw her hand on his knee. They were both laughing at something on the screen and she didn't move it right away. It was only when she saw me standing there that she pulled her hand back, a little too quickly. My heart sank. Something was happening, and it was no longer just in my head. That night I barely slept. I lay there staring at the ceiling, the shadows from the streetlight outside moving across the walls, my mind replaying that moment over and over. The way her hand rested on his knee like it belonged there, the way he didn't flinch or pull away, every laugh they'd shared, every time they'd stood a little too close, it all started fitting together in ways I didn't want to see. By morning I'd convinced myself I needed to be sure before I accused anyone of anything. I wasn't going to destroy my family over a gut feeling no matter how strong it was. So I started watching, quietly. I noticed little things. How Mark would check his phone and smile to himself. How he suddenly cared more about his appearance before going to the store or running errands. Melissa too seemed to glow differently when he was around, like she was in on some secret. One afternoon, I told Melissa I had a dentist appointment, even though I didn't. I left the house, parked my car a few streets over, and walked back quietly. Through the side window I saw them in the kitchen. Mark was leaning against the counter, Melissa standing in front of him, her hand resting on his chest as they talked in low voices. My stomach dropped, but I stayed frozen, afraid that moving would shatter something inside me for good. I didn't hear what they said, but I didn't need to. That kind of closeness wasn't an accident. I walked away before they could see me, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get my keys into the car door. That evening I pretended everything was normal. I made dinner, helped the kids with homework, laughed at their silly stories, all while feeling like I was moving through water. When Melissa left, I told Mark one had a headache, and went to bed early. Lying there I realized I had two choices. Confront them now, and risk them lying to my face. Or wait, watch, and gather proof so there could be no denial. I chose to wait, even though it felt like swallowing glass. Over the next week, Melissa kept coming by, and I kept pretending not to notice. I started keeping my phone close, snapping quick photos when I could without them realizing. A hand on his arm, the way they'd stand close enough for their shoulders to touch, the little smiles they'd share when they thought no one was looking. It felt like I was collecting pieces of a puzzle I didn't want to finish. But the worst part wasn't the evidence. It was the way Melissa would look me in the eye, ask about my day, hug me goodbye. She was still my friend in every other way, still the person who knew my kids, favorite snacks and the stories behind their favorite stuffed animals. And Mark, he was still my husband, the man I'd built a life with. Sitting at the kitchen table one night, staring at the pictures on my phone, I realized the truth wasn't going to stay hidden much longer. I could either let it crush me or decide what I was going to do about it. 2 days later, the kids had a sleepover at my sister's place, which should have been a rare, quiet night for me and Mark. Instead, he told me he had to catch up on work, and would be late. I played along, nodded, and said I'd probably just watch a movie. The moment he left, I grabbed my keys and followed, staying far enough back so he wouldn't notice. My hands were clammy on the steering wheel, my heart pounding so loud it felt like it filled the car. He didn't go to the office. He drove across town to Melissa's house. I parked a block away and watched as he got out of the car, walked up to her porch, and was greeted not with a handshake or a casual hello, but with a long, deliberate hug. She held on to him like she was claiming him. They went inside, and I sat there in the dark for what felt like hours, my mind a storm of anger, grief, and disbelief. When he finally came out, his hair was a little messy, and there was that same easy smile I hadn't seen him give me in months. I drove home ahead of him, got into bed, and pretended to be half asleep when he walked in. The smell of her perfume hit me like a punch in the chest. The next morning, Melissa texted me like nothing had happened, sending a funny meme about parenting. I stared at the screen, my fingers itching to type something sharp and final, but I didn't, not yet. I needed a plan. That day, I pulled out an old notebook and started writing everything down. Dates, times, what I saw, what I heard. It felt cold and methodical, that it kept me from falling apart. I knew if I confronted them without a plan, it would turn into a shouting match and they'd twist it around on me. I also started thinking about the kids, how this would affect them, how I'd explain why their dad wasn't home every night, why Melissa wouldn't be coming over anymore. They adored her. She was practically part of their daily lives. That was the worst part. She had inserted herself so deep into my family that removing her would feel like ripping out a piece of their childhood. Over the next week, my behavior didn't change. I still smiled when she dropped by, still poured her coffee, still let her play with the kids in the yard, but inside, every word I spoke to her was coated in the bitter knowledge of what she was doing. I started noticing how she'd look at Mark when she thought I wasn't watching, like he was hers already, and in a way, he was. One evening, while they sat at the kitchen counter talking about some TV show, I took a quiet photo of them from the hallway. The angle was perfect. You could see the way their knees touched under the counter, the way they leaned in toward each other like there was no one else in the world. I didn't know what I'd do with it yet, but it felt like holding a loaded weapon. The breaking point came on a rainy Thursday afternoon. Mark had told me he'd be home late again, and Melissa texted asking if she could help with the kids since the weather was too nasty for them to play outside. I told her sure, my voice steady even though my chest felt tight. She arrived in leggings and an oversized sweater, hair in a messy bun, looking every bit the comfortable friend she pretended to be. The kids were in the living room building a blanket fort, so I offered her tea. We stood in the kitchen, the kettle humming softly, when her phone buzzed on the counter. She stepped away to grab a tissue, and without thinking I glanced at the screen. Mark's name lit up in bold letters, followed by a preview of his text, "Can't wait to see you tonight." My breath caught. I didn't touch the phone, didn't scroll, but it didn't matter. The proof was right there, plain as day. She came back in, chatting about how much the kids had grown, completely unaware that I had just crossed an invisible line inside myself. I smiled, handed her the tea, and went to check on the kids, my hands shaking. That night, after she left, I sat at the kitchen table staring at the wood grain until Mark came home. He smelled faintly of her perfume again. I asked him how work was, and he mumbled something about a long meeting, not meeting my eyes. I realized in that moment that I no longer needed more proof. I had enough, too much really. The question wasn't if they were betraying me, it was how I was going to deal with it. Over the next few days, I distanced myself emotionally, watching them interact like an outsider studying a play. Every shared glance, every quick smile. It was all out in the open now, at least to me. I stopped trying to compete for Mark's attention. Instead, I focused on keeping my composure, on not giving either of them the satisfaction of seeing me crack. One Saturday morning I told Mark one was taking the kids to my sister's for the weekend. He didn't hesitate, just said, "Okay, have fun." That was all the confirmation I needed. I knew he'd use the time to be with her. As soon as I got to my sister's, I called a lawyer. We talked for an hour, going over the details, the timeline, the options. She told me to keep gathering evidence and to think carefully about my next steps. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I had a sliver of control again. That night, lying on my sister's couch while the kids slept in the next room, I stared at the ceiling and realized something. I wasn't just angry at Melissa for taking my husband. I was angry at myself for letting her so deep into my life, for ignoring the signs, for believing that her friendship was as genuine as mine. That anger was starting to burn hotter than the hurt, and I knew it wouldn't be long before I acted on it. When I came back from my sister's, the air in the house felt different, not in a way you could see or touch, but like walking into a room where someone's just had a private conversation, and you weren't supposed to hear it. Mark was unusually cheerful, moving around the kitchen with a lightness that made my stomach twist. Melissa didn't stop by that day, but I could feel her presence in the unspoken way his phone stayed face down on the counter and the faint scent of her perfume lingering on his hoodie, draped over a chair. That night after the kids were asleep, I opened my laptop and started a new folder. I titled it simply, Truth. Inside it, I placed the photos I'd taken, the notes from my notebook, and a screenshot of the text I'd seen pop up on Melissa's phone. Then I started writing. Every moment, every detail, every change I'd noticed in them, like I was building a timeline for a story I hadn't asked to live through. The more I wrote, the clearer my plan became. I wasn't going to confront them in some explosive, tear-filled scene. I wasn't going to give them the satisfaction of seeing me broken. I was going to let them trap themselves, and when the moment was right, I'd make sure the truth came out in a way they couldn't control. Over the next week, I kept my tone light, even friendly. I laughed at Mark's jokes, invited Melissa over for coffee, asked her opinion on a recipe. If she noticed the slight edge in my voice, she didn't show it. She probably thought she'd won, that I was too blind or too weak to see what was right in front of me. One afternoon, I told Melissa I needed her help with the kids while I ran errands. What I actually did was drive to her house, park a few houses away and wait. An hour later, Mark's car pulled up. He walked to her door without hesitation, let himself in like he'd done it 100 times. I snapped photo after photo, him arriving, him unlocking the door, him carrying a grocery bag inside like it was his second home. Then I left, my hands steady for the first time in weeks. That night I uploaded the photos to the folder, labeled them by date and backed everything up to a secure drive. I wasn't ready to pull the trigger yet, but the pieces were lining up exactly how I needed them. What I didn't expect was how calm I felt. The grief and confusion had dulled into something sharper, more deliberate. I realized I'd stopped asking why they were doing this and started asking how I was going to use it. Because if Melissa thought she could steal my husband and still play the role of my trusted friend, she was about to learn exactly who she'd underestimated. The idea came to me late one night while I was folding laundry in the quiet of the living room. It wasn't rage-fueled or impulsive, it was calculated. I knew Melissa's birthday was coming up in a couple of weeks, and she'd been dropping hints about wanting a small, cozy get-together with close friends. In her mind, I was still one of them. I decided that would be the perfect stage. I'd invite her over for a little celebration, tell her I'd make dinner, maybe even bake a cake. Mark would be there, of course. Why wouldn't he be? They wouldn't suspect a thing. But instead of a sweet, intimate evening, it would be the moment they'd see every lie laid out in front of them. Over the next days, I started gathering the last pieces I needed. I found a discreet voice recorder online, and had it shipped to my sister's house so Mark wouldn't see it. I placed it in the kitchen behind a stack of cookbooks, where I knew most of their conversations happened when I was busy. The first day I used it, my heart hammered so hard I thought they'd hear it from the next room. But when I played it back later, there it was. Melissa's laugh, low and soft, followed by Mark saying, "I wish we could just be open about this." My hands shook, but not from shock anymore. I already knew. This was confirmation, solid and undeniable. I added the recording to the folder, labeling it with the date and time. I also called my lawyer again, updating her on what I'd found. She advised me to stay calm, keep documenting and not give anything away. So that's what I did. The week before Melissa's birthday, I even took her out for coffee, listening as she complained about how tired she was from helping me so much, and how she barely had time for herself. I smiled, nodded, and thanked her like the good friend she pretended to be. Inside, every word she spoke made the fire in me burn hotter. On the morning of her birthday, I texted her an invite for dinner at our place. She responded with a string of heart emojis and, "Can't wait." Mark seemed pleased when I mentioned it, almost too eager. That evening I set the table with our nicest dishes, lit candles and made her favorite pasta. I even picked up a bottle of the wine she loved, the one she'd brought over more than once for movie nights. Everything looked perfect, like a snapshot of the friendship and marriage they thought they'd gotten away with destroying. What they didn't know was that in the living room, behind the row of books on the shelf, sat my laptop, already connected to the TV. And inside the folder marked Truth was the slideshow I'd prepared, each photo and recording ready to play in front of both of them. Melissa arrived right on time, carrying a small gift bag, and wearing a dress I'd seen her in once before at a barbecue we'd all gone to as friends. Mark greeted her at the door with a smile that felt too wide, too warm for someone who was supposed to be my husband. I hugged her, thanked her for coming and ushered her inside. The kids were spending the night at my sister's again, so it was just the three of us. We ate dinner, the conversation light and polite, with just enough small talk to hide the undercurrent of tension only I seemed to feel. I poured them both more wine, letting the room get comfortable, the mood soften. Then, when dessert was done, I stood up and said, "I actually have a little surprise for you, Melissa, something I've been working on." Her eyes lit up, probably expecting some sentimental slideshow of our friendship or a funny video from the kids. I walked to the living room, picked up the remote, and pressed play. The TV screen came to life with the first photo, Mark on her porch at night, the hug lingering longer than any hug between just friends should. The next slide was them in my kitchen, knees touching under the counter, smiles only for each other. Melissa froze, her hand halfway to her wineglass. Mark's face drained of color, his mouth opening slightly like he wanted to speak but couldn't find the words. I kept the slideshow going. Photo after photo, each one dated and time-stamped, each one chipping away at their denial. Then came the audio clips. Melissa's laugh, Mark's voice saying, "I wish we could just be open about this." Silence filled the room, heavy and suffocating. Melissa looked at me, her eyes wide, but I held her gaze without flinching. "I just thought," I said evenly, "that since you've both been keeping this part of your lives such a secret, maybe it deserved a little spotlight." Mark tried to speak, stammering something about it not being what it looked like, but the evidence kept playing, his own voice betraying him. Melissa shifted uncomfortably, her hands clasped in her lap, her face flushed. I didn't shout. I didn't cry. I simply stood there and let the truth fill every corner of the room, until there was nowhere for them to hide. When the last clip ended, I turned off the TV and said, "Dinner was nice, but this was the real main course." The quiet that followed was almost satisfying. Almost. For a long moment, no one moved. Mark's face was pale, his jaw tightening as he stared at the floor, avoiding my eyes entirely. Melissa fidgeted with the edge of her napkin, the confidence she always carried completely gone. She finally tried to speak, her voice small. It's not what you think." I almost laughed, because it was exactly what I thought, only worse. "Really?" I asked, my tone calm but sharp enough to cut. "Because your voices, your faces, your hands all seem to tell the same story." Mark finally looked up, his eyes hardening like he'd decided to stop pretending. "I didn't want you to find out like this," he said, which was almost funny, like there was a better way for me to discover my husband and my best friend were betraying me. "You didn't want me to find out at all," I replied. Melissa's cheeks flushed, and she muttered something about being sorry, but the words felt cheap, empty. I didn't respond to her apology. I didn't care for it. I stood, gathered the empty plates from the table, and carried them to the sink, letting the clatter of porcelain fill the silence. When I came back, I told them both plainly, "I've spoken to a lawyer. I have everything I need." That got Mark's attention. His head snapped up, and he started to speak, but I held up my hand. "Don't. You had months to talk to me, to come clean, to make a choice. You both made it. Now I'm making mine." I turned to Melissa. And you, don't come near my children again. Not at school, not at the park, not anywhere. You're done here." She nodded quickly, tears welling in her eyes. But I felt nothing for her. If anything, I felt lighter watching her squirm. They both got up to leave, Mark muttering that he'd come back for his things. I didn't ask when. When the door finally closed behind them, the silence that filled the house wasn't heavy anymore. It was clean, almost peaceful. I sat at the kitchen table with the last of my wine, staring at the flickering candle until it burned out, and realized something. I hadn't just taken my life back tonight. I'd taken away the story they thought they were writing without me. The next morning I woke up earlier than usual. The house was still, the air cool from the night rain, and for the first time in months I didn't feel that knot of dread in my stomach. I made coffee, sat at the table with my laptop, and sent an email to my lawyer confirming I wanted to move forward with the divorce. It was strangely methodical, signing papers, scanning documents, listing assets, like cleaning out a closet you'd been avoiding for too long. The emotions came later, in waves, but that morning I was focused. I told the kids that afternoon. I didn't tell them the whole truth, they were too young for that, but I said that Daddy and I had decided to live in different houses, that we both loved them very much, and that nothing they did caused it. My daughter's eyes welled up, and my son just looked confused. They asked if they'd still see Daddy, and I promised they would. It broke something in me to make that promise, knowing how betrayed I felt, but I wasn't going to let Mark's choices rob them of their father. Word spread quickly in our small circle. A few mutual friends reached out, some with genuine concern, others fishing for details. I kept my answers short. Melissa didn't try to contact me again, though I heard from a neighbor that Mark had been spending most of his nights at her place. It didn't sting the way I thought it would, it just confirmed that I'd done the right thing. The hardest part was adjusting to the new rhythm of the house. Evenings without Mark's presence felt both lonely and strangely free. I could cook what I wanted, let the kids stay up a little later, play music in the kitchen without worrying about his mood. Slowly, the weight of their betrayal started to shift from raw pain to something I could carry without it crushing me. My lawyer advised me to stay patient, that dragging them into court would only make things messier, especially with the kids involved. But she also reminded me that I was in a strong position, and that gave me a quiet sort of strength. Some nights I'd lie in bed and think about the slideshow, the look on their faces, the way the truth had landed like a stone in the middle of the room. It wasn't revenge exactly, it was clarity, and once you see the truth that clearly, you can't go back to living in the blur. The divorce papers were signed on a grey Tuesday afternoon. There was no dramatic scene. No shouting across a courtroom, just signatures on a stack of documents that marked the official end of a life I'd spent years building. I walked out of that office with my coat pulled tight around me, the cold air stinging my cheeks, and for the first time in months, I felt something close to relief. Mark moved in with Melissa not long after. I didn't ask, but people told me, neighbors, mutual acquaintances, even one of the mums from school who couldn't help herself. At first I braced for the pain, expecting it to hit like a wave, but it never came the way I thought it would. Instead, there was this quiet satisfaction in knowing they'd built their new life on the rubble of lies. I didn't need to wish them misery, I knew it would find them on its own. You can't build trust on betrayal. It collapses eventually. I focused on my kids, on our new routines, on filling the house with moments that felt like ours again. I took them to the park more, signed them up for art classes, started cooking Sunday breakfasts where we'd eat pancakes in our pajamas, and laugh about nothing. Little by little, the home felt warm again. Some nights when the kids were asleep and the house was still, I'd think about Melissa, not with anger anymore, but with a strange sort of pity. She'd stolen something she thought was worth having, only to realize it wasn't the prize she imagined. And Mark, he'd traded the loyalty of someone who would have stood beside him through anything for the thrill of something temporary. My revenge wasn't in taking anything from them. It was in not letting them take any more from me. The slideshow, the photos, the recordings. They were the moment I took my power back, and I never let it go again. I learned that sometimes the best revenge isn't loud or cruel. Sometimes it's simply moving on so completely that the people who broke you have no place in the life you've rebuilt. And as I tucked my kids into bed each night, their little arms wrapped around my neck, I knew exactly who I was again. Not the wife who'd been betrayed, not the friend who'd been lied to, but the woman who'd walked through the fire and come out the other side without letting it burn her down.